Flight 642 was a scheduled cargo flight operated by a trusted airline, known for its reliability and adherence to safety protocols. On board were experienced pilots who had logged thousands of flight hours, making them more than capable of handling the aircraft. The plane itself, a well-maintained wide-body jet, had undergone all necessary checks before departure. Everything pointed to a routine journey, free of complications. The flight originated from one of the airline's major hubs, loaded with cargo bound for its destination. The crew conducted their pre-flight checks meticulously, going through every item on the checklist with precision. The aircraft's systems appeared to be in optimal condition, the weather at departure was clear, and there were no signs of any mechanical issues. With clearance from air traffic control, the massive jet taxied to the runway, engines humming as it prepared for takeoff. As the aircraft roared down the runway and lifted into the sky, the initial phase of the flight proceeded as expected. The pilots maintained communication with air traffic controllers, receiving updates on weather conditions and any potential changes to their route. Climbing to cruising altitude, the flight was uneventful, exactly what any pilot or airline would hope for. Throughout the journey, the pilots monitored their instruments, ensuring everything was functioning within normal parameters. The aircraft's autopilot system was engaged, allowing the crew to focus on navigation, fuel management, and situational awareness. Occasionally, they encountered slight turbulence, but nothing out of the ordinary for a long-haul flight. The crew responded with minor adjustments, keeping the plane stable and on course. As the aircraft neared its destination, the pilots prepared for descent. They reviewed the approach charts, double-checked their landing configuration, and confirmed runway conditions with air traffic control. Weather reports indicated strong crosswinds, but nothing that should have posed a significant challenge for an experienced crew. The pilots had dealt with similar conditions before and knew the necessary procedures to counteract the effects of the wind. With everything in place, the descent began. The aircraft gradually lost altitude, smoothly transitioning from cruise to approach. The pilots coordinated with controllers, ensuring proper alignment with the runway. The final approach was critical. This was the phase where minor errors could quickly escalate into dangerous situations. Inside the cockpit, the pilots made their final adjustments. They configured the aircraft for landing, extending the flaps and lowering the landing gear. Every control input was deliberate, following standard operating procedures to ensure a safe touchdown. Despite the strong winds, they remained confident in their ability to handle the situation. As the runway came into view, the aircraft lined up perfectly with its intended path. The pilots remained focused, making constant adjustments to keep the plane steady. But just as they approached touchdown, something unexpected happened. A sudden gust of wind disrupted the descent, causing the aircraft to tilt slightly. The pilots reacted instantly, trying to correct the angle and stabilize the approach. At this moment, precision was everything. A safe landing depended on quick reflexes and the right control inputs. However, as the aircraft's wheels made contact with the runway, the landing was far from smooth. The force of impact was much harder than anticipated. The jet bounced, struggling to regain stability as it skidded across the runway. The pilots fought to regain control, but the situation had already spiraled beyond their grasp. The aircraft veered off course, sparks flying as metal scraped against the tarmac. Panic filled the cockpit as they attempted to slow down, but the momentum was too great. Within moments, the jet came to a halt, damaged, smoking, and surrounded by chaos. What should have been a routine landing had turned into a catastrophic event. The immediate concern was the safety of those on board. Emergency crews rushed to the scene, their sirens cutting through the night as they worked to contain the damage. The wreckage of Flight 642 lay scattered across the runway, a grim reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. The impact was violent, sending shockwaves through the aircraft as it struck the runway harder than expected. The pilots, despite their experience, were momentarily disoriented by the force of the touchdown. The nose of the plane pitched forward as the wheels struggled to maintain grip on the slick tarmac. Almost immediately, alarms blared in the cockpit, signaling multiple system failures. The aircraft had not landed as planned, and now the crew was in a desperate fight to regain control. The main landing gear, taking the brunt of the impact, was severely strained. The plane bounced slightly before making a second, more forceful contact with the ground. The excessive force caused structural damage, weakening the integrity of the undercarriage. The aircraft's tires screeched as they struggled to maintain traction, and within seconds, the situation deteriorated further. The plane lurched to the side, tilting at a dangerous angle. The pilots gripped the controls, trying to stabilize the aircraft, but the uneven weight distribution made it nearly impossible to correct the movement. The strong crosswinds, already a challenge, now worked against them, pushing the plane off its intended path. The aircraft veered sideways, skidding uncontrollably across the runway. Sparks erupted as metal scraped against concrete, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Inside the cockpit, the crew rapidly assessed their options. The speed at which they were moving meant that stopping the aircraft in time was a near impossibility. The runway lights flashed past in a blur, and every second that passed brought them closer to disaster. The pilots deployed every braking mechanism available, engaging the reverse thrust in a desperate attempt to slow down. But with the plane's balance compromised, their efforts were only partially effective. The aircraft's left landing gear gave way under the pressure, causing the fuselage to tilt even further. The left engine, positioned close to the ground, scraped along the runway, sending a shower of sparks into the air. The friction generated an intense heat, adding another layer of danger to an already catastrophic situation. The smell of burning rubber and scorched metal filled the air as the plane continued its uncontrolled slide. For the emergency response teams stationed near the runway, it was clear that Flight 642 was in serious trouble. They had been monitoring the landing closely, and the moment they saw the aircraft struggling, they sprang into action. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue personnel raced toward the scene, bracing for the worst. Back in the cockpit, the pilots knew they were running out of runway. If they didn't come to a stop soon, they risked crashing beyond the airport's perimeter. They fought against the forces pulling the aircraft sideways, trying to maintain some level of control. But as the nose of the plane dipped further, it was clear that the damage was extensive. Then the inevitable happened. The aircraft's left wing struck the ground, sending a violent jolt through the fuselage. The impact was enough to rupture one of the fuel tanks, releasing a highly flammable mist into the air. Within moments, a fire ignited, the flames spreading quickly along the underside of the plane. The pilots, now faced with a growing inferno, had only one priority: getting everyone to safety. As soon as the aircraft came to a final, jarring halt, they initiated the emergency evacuation procedures. The fire, fueled by leaking fuel, threatened to engulf the plane within minutes. The crew moved swiftly, issuing instructions through the intercom while simultaneously working to deploy the emergency exits. Outside, emergency teams were already in position, racing to contain the fire before it spread further. Foam cannons sprayed thick layers of suppressant onto the burning sections of the aircraft, while rescue teams rushed toward the fuselage to assist any survivors. The intensity of the heat made the situation even more dire. Thick black smoke billowed into the night sky, reducing visibility for both the crew and the emergency responders. Despite the chaos, the evacuation had to proceed as quickly as possible. The crew, following their training, ensured that all available exits were utilized. Slide deployments were activated, giving those inside a means to escape. The priority was getting everyone out before the fire reached critical levels. Meanwhile, air traffic control monitored the situation from the tower, relaying crucial information to ground teams. The entire airport was now focused on containing the disaster, with additional fire units arriving to reinforce the initial response. As passengers and crew made their way out of the aircraft, they were quickly ushered to safety by rescue teams. The fire continued to rage, but the swift actions of emergency personnel prevented it from escalating further. Within minutes, the flames were brought under control, though the aircraft itself had suffered severe damage. As the last of the crew evacuated, the realization set in: Flight 642, a routine journey, had ended in disaster. The charred wreckage on the runway stood as a stark reminder of how quickly an ordinary landing could turn catastrophic. Though lives had been spared, the incident left behind more questions than answers. The focus now shifted to understanding what had gone wrong. Investigators would soon arrive to examine every detail, from the moment the plane touched down to the final seconds before it stopped. Every piece of debris, every mark on the runway, and every cockpit recording would be scrutinized to uncover the truth behind the ill-fated landing. The investigation into the crash of Flight 642 began almost immediately. With the wreckage still smoldering on the runway, teams of experts arrived to piece together the events that had led to the disaster. Every detail mattered. Every scrape on the fuselage, every mark on the tarmac, every signal recorded by the aircraft's black boxes. Investigators from aviation authorities, representatives from the airline, and safety experts collaborated to uncover the truth. The first step was securing the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder. These black boxes, designed to withstand extreme conditions, held vital information about the moments leading up to the crash. Engineers carefully extracted them from the wreckage and transported them to a specialized lab for analysis. Meanwhile, ground crews documented the aircraft's position, taking photographs and mapping out the debris field to understand how the plane had moved during its uncontrolled landing. Eyewitness accounts were gathered from air traffic controllers, emergency responders, and anyone who had observed the approach. Radar data was reviewed to determine the aircraft's speed, altitude, and trajectory. The goal was to find out whether external factors such as weather, mechanical failure, or human error had played a role in the incident. One of the first areas of focus was the weather at the time of landing. Reports confirmed that strong crosswinds had been present, but investigators needed to determine if they were within acceptable limits. Aircraft are designed to withstand challenging wind conditions, and experienced pilots are trained to handle turbulence and sudden gusts. The recorded wind speeds were compared against the airline's operational guidelines to see if the landing should have been attempted in the first place. Attention then turned to the structural damage sustained by the aircraft. Engineers examined the landing gear, looking for signs of pre-existing weakness or failure. The severity of the impact suggested that excessive force had been applied upon touchdown, which could indicate a miscalculated approach. Investigators analyzed the hydraulic systems, braking mechanisms, and engine performance to determine if any malfunctions had contributed to the loss of control. As the black box data was reviewed, the final moments before impact became clearer. The cockpit voice recordings provided insight into the crew's decision-making process. Every command, every adjustment, and every reaction was scrutinized. The investigators listened carefully to how the pilots had communicated, checking for any signs of confusion, hesitation, or incorrect procedures. One key question emerged: had the pilots misjudged their descent? Data from the flight recorder indicated that the aircraft had descended slightly faster than normal in the final approach. A steeper angle combined with the force of the crosswinds could have resulted in the hard landing. Additionally, analysis of control inputs revealed that the pilots had attempted to correct their descent at the last second, possibly overcompensating for the gust of wind that had tilted the aircraft. Further examination of the landing gear confirmed that the left side had absorbed more impact than the right, suggesting that the plane had touched down unevenly. This imbalance could have contributed to the rapid loss of control, causing the aircraft to veer sideways upon landing. The condition of the runway was also taken into account. While it was clear of obstacles, investigators checked whether surface conditions had worsened the situation. The airline provided maintenance records to rule out any pre-existing mechanical faults. Routine inspections had been carried out on schedule, with no indications of structural weakness or hydraulic failure. This reinforced the theory that the crash had been caused by a combination of external conditions and last-minute control inputs rather than an inherent flaw in the aircraft itself. The final report needed to address one crucial factor: had proper procedures been followed? While the pilots were highly trained, stress and time constraints can sometimes lead to miscalculations. Simulator recreations of the flight were conducted to test different scenarios and determine if an alternative approach could have resulted in a safer landing. These simulations provided valuable insight into how similar conditions could be handled in the future. As the evidence was compiled, the investigators reached their conclusion. The crash was determined to be the result of an unstable approach, compounded by difficult wind conditions and a hard touchdown. The aircraft had been flying at a slightly higher descent rate than ideal, and the corrective action taken in the final moments had not been enough to prevent disaster. The recommendations from the report would focus on improving pilot training for handling extreme crosswinds and reinforcing the importance of go-around procedures when an approach becomes unstable. While the cause had been identified, the investigation also led to discussions on safety improvements. Aviation authorities reviewed the findings to determine whether adjustments should be made to landing protocols. Airlines were advised to emphasize training on recognizing unstable approaches and executing timely go-arounds when necessary. Flight 642 had ended in disaster, but its lessons would help prevent future incidents. The findings from the investigation served as a reminder of the precision required in aviation and the thin margin for error when landing under challenging conditions. Every crash is a tragedy, but each one also leads to improvements that make flying safer for everyone. The conclusions drawn from the investigation did not just answer the lingering questions about Flight 642's fate. They served as a stark reminder of the unforgiving nature of aviation. Every moment in the cockpit demands precision, and even the slightest miscalculation can lead to catastrophe. The findings were clear. While the pilots had done their best under challenging conditions, the unstable approach and hard landing had set off a chain of events that could not be reversed. The airline took immediate steps to implement the recommendations from the final report. Training programs were updated to emphasize handling strong crosswinds and executing go-arounds when an approach was not stabilized. Pilots were given additional simulator training to practice similar scenarios, ensuring that they could recognize the warning signs of a dangerous descent before it was too late. Aviation regulators also reviewed protocols, looking for ways to strengthen safety measures across the industry. Beyond procedural changes, the accident left a lasting impact on those involved. The pilots, despite their extensive experience, were deeply affected by the event. They had been trained to handle emergencies, but the reality of losing control in those critical moments weighed heavily on them. The crew members who had worked tirelessly to evacuate the aircraft in the aftermath carried the memory of that night with them. For the first responders who rushed to the burning wreckage, the experience was a reminder of how unpredictable aviation incidents could be. Survivors of the crash, though fortunate to have escaped, could not forget the terror of those final moments. The sheer force of the impact, the chaos as the plane skidded across the runway, and the blinding heat of the fire were images that remained with them. Some struggled with the trauma, while others found solace in the fact that they had made it out alive. For them, stepping onto a plane again required courage, but many did, determined not to let fear dictate their lives. The aviation industry thrives on learning from past mistakes, and Flight 642 became another case study in the pursuit of safer skies. The crash was analyzed in training programs, its lessons taught to new pilots entering the field. Every recorded data point, every decision made in the cockpit, and every second leading up to the impact contributed to a deeper understanding of what went wrong and how it could be prevented in the future. Airports also took note of the findings, evaluating their emergency response strategies to improve reaction times and coordination in similar incidents. Firefighting teams reviewed their approach to handling aircraft fires, ensuring that every second counted in the race to contain the flames before they spread beyond control. Ground crews trained for quicker evacuations, knowing that efficiency could mean the difference between life and death. Though the wreckage was eventually cleared and the airport resumed normal operations, the memory of Flight 642 lingered. Every crash leaves a mark, not just on the industry but on the people who witness it firsthand. Pilots, airline staff, and passengers alike carried the weight of what had happened, using it as a reminder of how crucial vigilance and preparation are in aviation. For the families of those involved, closure came not just from understanding what had gone wrong, but from knowing that steps were being taken to prevent it from happening again. Safety in aviation is built on the lessons of past tragedies, and every protocol strengthened as a result of an accident ensures that the same mistake is never repeated. In the end, Flight 642 became more than just a tragic event. It became a turning point. It reinforced the importance of precision in every landing, the necessity of making split-second decisions, and the value of preparedness in the face of uncertainty. While the crash could never be undone, Its legacy lived on in the improvements it inspired. Aviation moves forward because it learns, adapts, and evolves with every challenge it faces. Flight 642 was one of those challenges, a moment in history that reminded everyone in the industry why safety can never be taken for granted. The skies remain unpredictable, but with every lesson learned, they become safer for those who travel through them.